Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Teacher Takeaway Series Season 2. This is Webinar 4. Today, Fraser Bewick will talk about adapting teaching English web-based resources for the Korean classroom. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm the chairperson of this webinar. My name is Kyungja An. I'm a professor of English Education Department and primary English education major and TESOL major at the Graduate School of Education at Seoul National University of Education. In this webinar, British Council Korea, British Council English Programs Team, and SNUE are collaborating. Now, I'd like to introduce Fraser Bewick of this webinar. Fraser Bewick is a senior academic consultant for the British Council. He has over 20 years experience of English language teaching, training, and consultancy in various areas within ELT and English medium higher education in China and other contexts across East Asia. He has worked in both private and public education sectors and has participated in and managed education projects across the region. He was previously also a CELTA tutor and ELT materials and textbook designer. He was the lead foreign author and consultant for the PP Primary Textbook Series, currently used by millions of students in public schools across China. Now, please join me welcoming Fraser Bewick for his presentation.
Thank you so much, Kyungja. That's very kind of you. I'll share my screen now. Thank you so much for the introduction. And annyeonghaseyo, everyone. I hope I got that right. As Kyungja said, my name is Fraser Bewick, and I'm a consultant with the British Council. It's really a pleasure to join you today for today's session. Now, as you'll see from the title, I've added a little bit extra here to my title, and that's templates and mantras, because I think today I'd like to introduce a few ideas that perhaps we can take away and not just use with British Council resources, but use with any online resources. And it gives us, if you like, a framework within which we can work. So I hope that's helpful. And of course, adding templates and mantras makes the title a little bit more interesting as well. Now, today's session is in English, and I'm joining you from a very frosty sub-zero Glasgow in the UK. I hope that's okay for everyone. I will try to keep my Scottish accent under control through the duration of today's session, but please do let me know in the chat if you'd like me to change the speed or if there's any issues with the way I'm delivering today. I'm very happy to hear from you. The previous sessions in this series have been in Korean, as I mentioned, and they've been talking about the future. I think things like AI, areas of digital resource, and things that we can do or look forward to in the future. But today I wanted to really focus on the present and how we can look to adapt digital resources that we have available now. And of course, I'm going to focus on the British Council resources primarily because last year, as many of you may know, the Teaching English resources were mapped to the Korean curriculum. So that gives us a good starting point for today. Now, I'd like to start with a little task. And here you'll see, I hope, a box that says PMI. And PMI stands for positive minus interesting. And this little task gives us a chance to think about things from different perspectives. So actually, it's a very useful critical thinking tool. It's created by a man called Edward de Bono. So it was a psychological tool at first, but now it's something I think we can also look at adapting into English language teaching because it provides a language opportunity. So I'd like to ask you the question at the top, what are your general thoughts on online resources? So we are talking about digital. If in the chat you could help me by adding one positive thought you have, one negative thought, i.e. minus, and one interesting point you'd like to make about online resources. So this could be an innovative way that you use the resources. It could be something that you found online you think is a bit different, anything that you think would be interesting to share. So if I could ask you, just use PMI in the chat now, and please add some ideas if you can and share them with the group. So we could start with positive, perhaps, I hope. Any ideas? Thank you, Olivia. P, accessible, so they're accessible. Very much so, I think, in most contexts. Perhaps there are issues in certain parts of Asia where mobile phone penetration or internet penetration could be a problem, but generally, yes. Thank you. Any other positives? Authentic, great. Practical, I hope so, yes. Some of them are free, yes, some, not all, unfortunately. Instant feedback, that's an interesting one. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit. Individualistic access, great. Many ideas, absolutely. Ubiquitous, great word. Prompt, yep. Immediately accessible, intriguing. Fantastic. So some great points there in relation to digital, but what about the other side of that? What about the minus? We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Great. Minus credibility. Interesting. Okay. We might not know who created it, whether it's accurate or not. Less authentic, possibly, especially if it's been created by someone. Lack of instruction. Yep. Tech problems. Yes, I've met many of those. Less guidance. Unreliable. Fantastic. Distractive. That's an interesting one. Abstract. Yep. Okay, great. So we have some minuses. And what about I? Anything interesting? Anything else you'd like to add about online resources that you'd like to share? Hard to interact with students mutually. In courses, yes. Yes, I think that's more course related. I think for resources, things that we could perhaps as teachers take and use in the classroom. I think there are certainly many new tools that are emerging all the time. I'm not sure what the tools would be in Korea, but certainly in China, where I spent a lot of time, and in the UK, there are many tools being used in classrooms now, can connect to people easily. Fantastic. Vast resources, absolutely. Okay, so some great ideas there, so thank you for that. I think one of the minuses we haven't perhaps touched upon, and something I'd like to highlight from the very beginning, is that the materials are quite generic. As you all know, as teachers, that the materials you use are generally tailored to the needs of your students. And of course, like any textbook, online resources are going to be generic, global, and for the wider audience rather than specific students. So ultimately, there's going to be a need for us to adapt those resources. And I think that's a key point when it comes to using online resources that are not specifically designed by yourself. So I hope today we'll look at that in a little bit more detail that you'll find useful. Now, I've shown you this tool. It's a PMI tool. It's by Edward de Bono. It's a psychological or psychology informed tool. Some people might say it's crazy to use such tools, but I do think they're really great opportunities to integrate new ideas into learning. I've used it as a lead-in today, if you like, in a formal language classroom sense. But do you think you could perhaps consider this in some other area of the classroom? Any ideas in the chat where you could use this PMI skill in a class that you're teaching? Please share in the chat now if you have any ideas. So we'll start with a lead-in. I'll put that in the chat now as one place we could use it. Where else could we use it? Unit review, great. Yep. Giving feedback, excellent, excellent. Or eliciting feedback, certainly, brilliant. Brainstorming, okay. Making decisions. Activity feedback, great. Lesson planning, yes. Evaluate sources, yes, I think that encapsulates it quite nicely. It's a tool of evaluation. So actually, what that tool is doing is promoting higher order thinking within the students. It's if you like, a critical thinking tool, because it allows students to consider different perspectives. They may have an idea that something is good, i.e. positive, but we're forcing them to think of some other angle where they can consider the problem. So the other area that I think this is very useful in particular is for follow-up tasks for reading, or extension tasks for reading or listening, to really round up a task and integrate 21st century skills into activities. So I want to highlight that because it's something I love to do myself, and I really emphasize as something that's important when thinking about our classrooms. And this is one example of that problem solving. Thank you, Student Kim. So the other point I wanted to make about this simple tool is it's an opportunity to show how we can adapt something simple that we take from a previous idea, or as today we're discussing an online resource. We can take it, we can adapt it. We have all of these ideas, and these are ways we can use it that work for us. So we'll come back to the PMI tool a little bit later, but I just wanted to make that point at the beginning today. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to be referring to the British Council Teacher Takeaways 2022 resource. This was delivered, the sessions as we're doing today was delivered entirely in Korean. This year we have a couple of English sessions with myself and my colleague Ian next week, and please do join for that event. But the outputs of that were bilingual. And one of the goals of that program was to map resources to the Korean national curriculum. And as, of course, this was funded by the British Council, we started with Teaching English resources. Teaching English is a website run by the British Council that supplies teaching resources for teachers, just in case you're not aware. And there are thousands of resources there, and we've tried to map some of them. But of course, as I mentioned, these resources will, by definition, be generic because they're not just for the Korean context, they're for a global audience. So we really need to go further beyond just looking and taking the resource and thinking about how we can adapt that resource for our needs. And that's the crux, if you like, of today's session. The Teaching English resource is there, but I'd like to emphasize that, while context may be different, ideas are often the same, and often a lesson will build from a wonderful idea by a teacher educator. And then, of course, it has to be built into a full lesson. So sometimes, in all honesty, there's a bit of fluff, there's a bit of padding to the lesson. It's not always the greatest of resource. But within that lesson or within that activity, there's often a kernel of brilliance, a rough diamond, if you like, that we can look for when we're going through these resources. So I'd like to use the mantra at the bottom of today to this slide, which is adapt, adopt, and reject. Of course, these are three options we have with any resource, but I put adapt in capital letters because I do feel that there's always the opportunity to adapt, not just to take it all or use it all, but within those lessons, there's often something we can find and integrate into our own lessons. And today, hopefully, some of the templates and the ideas will feed into that. So take a snapshot of that QR code there. If you want, you can check that later. The documents and resources can be found on that website. So to give you an idea of what is mapped, well, we have articles, research, video resources, podcasts, activities, lesson plans. I've highlighted the latter two in red because those are the two I'll focus on today, but the resources are out there if you wish to access them, and they're within the British Council Teaching English website that I mentioned before and that Kunya shared earlier as you came into the lobby of the session. And just as a final plug, if you like, the world's largest online communities, so there is the opportunity for you to access resources there and share your ideas with other teachers. So if you feel you would like to, please do join that community. So when this was done, and I've taken one example from the Korean national curriculum here, which is looking at personal life, and that is broken into three sub-themes, if you like, or three areas. From personal life, we're moving to leisure activities, hobbies, entertainment, travel, sports, and shopping, and then health management, and then everyday life, such as birthdays, interests, and lifestyle. So those are the, if you like, the key tenets of the curriculum. And within that, we have sub-themes. So the mapping document does go down to the level of some sub-themes. And again, I've highlighted two in red because I've taken a couple at random from the mapping just to give an example today. From that, the difficulty that you have as teachers is deciding what online resources do I use? What can I use? What should I use? What shouldn't I use? And that will come down to, of course, personal preference, the students that you teach, and what works for you in the classroom. So I'm certainly not asking you to change anything that works for you in the classroom. What I hope to touch on today is thinking about how we can take what works and then start to plug ideas into that, plug and play, if you like. So we're going to focus on a couple of activities that look at health and shopping. And please do keep in mind what I said at the beginning. These are generic activities. These are global activities. So on their own, you searching for them and looking at them, they're probably not going to look that attractive. But considering perhaps taking a step back and using that PMI, can we think of ways that we can use these ideas or find those rough diamonds within that activity or lesson plan? That's what I hope we will take away from today. So when we have activities, we're going to look at it and we're going to ask ourselves some questions. So I think these are some of the key questions that I would ask, and I'm sure you have your own questions as well. First of all, does it fit into my lesson? And that is in terms of content, but of course, as many teachers will highlight, in terms of time. One of the things I notice on many of the Teaching English website resources is the lesson plans are long. They're 90 minutes. They're perhaps designed for a more private language teaching audience. So we have to think about how we can cut that down and adapt it for a session that might be 40, 45 minutes, or even less if it's a very, very young audience. So does it fit? Can it fit? Can it be adapted to fit? What's the purpose of the activity? Because this is something I think we don't always think about when we see an idea, but I would certainly hazard a guess that the vast majority of activities that we find online are for review purposes. They're there to practice language the students have already learned. So games, for example, they're using language that the student has learned. So I would call that a practice or a review activity. It may be a test. We test what they know, and perhaps we can use that as a teaching opportunity. But the majority of games online tend to be practice and review. So we have to think, how can we plug that into our lesson? Where should we plug it in? Would it be a lead-in as a test at the beginning? Or would it be something we use later in the lesson to practice and round up the lesson in a fun way? So the other thing that we want to think about, and this again goes back to the PMI scale, is can we go deeper? Are we just doing an activity, feeding back very quickly, getting an answer, well done, son, and then we move on? Or can we extend that activity? Can we use the feedback stage, which I think was highlighted in the chat earlier, to go deeper, to use why questions, to understand how students came to answers, to perhaps use student-centered feedback, peer feedback, to help them learn together. So these are all opportunities that we have when we're adapting activities, because essentially you have the freedom to create it in any way you wish, but of course it has to be suitable for your classroom. Now, here is an example. This was taken from the British Council mapping, and I put a QR code here so you can go directly to the page if you wish. You'll see here, this is what you'll find in the mapping document. So I've taken from the theme of shopping to the sub-theme. It's an activity, as you can see. The title of the activity is shopping at the mini market, and then you'll find a link to the activity which you can follow through to look at that. Now, when we look at this, we can see a few things. We can see it's a review activity. It's reviewing uncountable and countable nouns. So we know what type of activity it is, and this already perhaps gets us thinking where we can put this in our lesson. And that's not to say there's always a fixed position. This is something that we would have flexibility with. We also see that there's a drawing activity in this, and this is something that's going to take time. But again, is this something that can adapt and work within the lesson format and time and objective that I have? We also see there's an element of teacher elicitation, and of course that would be the feedback stage. And this is something that we can copy as the activity suggests, or we can shake it up a little bit and try something different. And the other thing that stood out for me in this description was students mingling. Mingling simply means that the students will stand up and move around the class, and instead of having fixed pair work, they'll have pair work with different students in the class, perhaps moving from one to the other for a period of 5 to 10 minutes. And this is a great activity. It engages students, it motivates them, but it's not always practical for smaller, tighter classrooms with fixed seating, or indeed classrooms where time is an issue because it can take quite a lot of time to do. So these are key elements that I would take from this. I'd be thinking already, how can I adapt this? Now, one way that I like to look at this when I'm thinking of adapting is I'll go through some of the different ways or different objectives of activities. So from what I saw there, it's a review activity. So you can see that I've highlighted this in orange, but there's often a link between review, a test activity where students are simply tested on something to see what they already know, rather than reviewing something the teacher's confident they already know, and a teach activity, because with a teach or with a review, with a test or with a review, there's often a teach aspect to that to follow up and correct where students are struggling or have some errors. Other reasons that we might have an activity is simply to present something. So it might be a lead-in, for example, that presents a context, or it activates students' previous knowledge. So often when we have warmers or lead-ins, there may not be a language focus or a specific focus in relation to the content of the lesson, but it does have a purpose within the lesson. So make students engaged, motivate them, interest them in the topic, get them thinking, even their own language, about what the topic might include. And I've put one more at the bottom. It says other, and I'll come to that in just a second, because I'd like to add these additional stages that I like to think about when I'm adapting a lesson or an activity in this case. Is what's the purpose? How can I fit it into my class flow? Do I want it at the beginning or the end? What do I want to get from the activity? So by this, I mean a success criteria. So what do students have to do? How do they have to think about the task? What's the end goal? And how can I elicit and understand that they've achieved that goal? So these are things I'm thinking about. I'm going to break down the activity into 3 sections in a moment that will help me to answer that. From that, again, to re-emphasize, how can I extend that activity? How can I help students explore a bit more deeply? If you think about, for example, an activity where students might elicit, and this is purely off the top of my head, different forms of transportation. And as part of the exercise, you've elicited to the board train, bus, plane, ship, etc. Looking at that, you could stop there and say, okay, students have understood the task. They've been able to present the vocabulary to me. That might be the success criteria you're looking for. But how can we go further? How can we perhaps develop other skills in students? And one of the ways I might think about is using a climb or a ranking activity where you could ask students, okay, now could you look at these and which do you think is heaviest? Which do you think is fastest? Which do you think is slowest? Now, this may require some pre-teach if the students are not familiar with the adjectives. It may be a review. There may be some language consideration there dependent on the task that you're doing, but it's thinking about how you can take that next step. I'm sure, and certainly in many of the classrooms that I've seen, teachers are far more proficient and very proficient in many cases in developing 21st century skills. But still, I see teachers concerned about how they can do this within what they have to teach within the curriculum. Or will it take a whole class to develop something like creativity or critical thinking? I would say no. I would say think about how you can integrate it into your task, whether it's through extension or adapting the task slightly, because actually all we have to do is tweak. We have to change a little bit so we can include that within the lesson that we have. So it's good to have it in the stages we're thinking about as we're adapting activities. Now, I'd like to add this question, again, just to the chat. I have other here. What could other be? Any ideas, any other purposes that activities might serve that you might want to think about in the structure of your lesson? Please share any ideas you have in the chat. So I've given 4, I think the most common, but what else might we include? I've actually perhaps given some away in what I've been saying in the last minute. Any ideas? Level of students, okay. So we certainly, when we're creating activities, it's very important to consider the level of students, and that may require creating separate or parallel activities that suit the students. It is interesting though, I remember from the CELTA course, there was often a mantra that was used that said, grade the task, not the text. And we touched on authenticity at the beginning of today, and whatever the context or the text that we're using, rather than changing that to suit a student, it's important that we consider adapting the task to make it achievable for different levels of students. Now, they may get slightly different things from that, but rather than taking away the experience of authentic resources, we can adapt the activities. So it's a nice point to raise. Connect it to broad course goals. Okay, so I think that would be maybe at a higher level, but that's a nice suggestion. I think we want it at quite a granular level here in terms of what you want that activity to do in the class. Form of the activity, such as individual pair work or group work. Okay, I think definitely that's something we want to think about, and I think that could be part of all of them, because that's a choice you will make based on your students, your classroom, and of course, many other factors within the class. But I would always recommend trying to use the students to teach each other where we can. Okay, so I touched on some. Other may include, for example, lead-in, warmer, motivational, a pickup or an energizer activity. So with longer classes, sometimes it's good to stop the class for a minute and think about something fun students can do to bring them back, bring their attention back, especially in the afternoon. So I think there's definitely a practical suggestion there, a practical use of such activities within the class as well. And it's good to have them in your back pocket, as we say, so you can use them at any time. So reinforcement activity, great. Thank you, Olivia. So I think perhaps that's quite similar to review. That's great. Providing an enjoyable experience for the learners, yes. I hope our lessons are all enjoyable experiences, but certainly engaging to students. Great, thank you, Jonathan. Great, thank you for those ideas. That's fantastic. So it's already getting us to think about the type of activity we want. And of course, the activity we just saw was a review activity. So I'd like to perhaps take that and think about how we can change it. So I'm glad that you mentioned student-centered activity in the comments there, because I think one of the key ways we can change a review or a practice activity is through the students themselves, using the students as a resource to help teach each other. This often comes through comparison or peer feedback, where at the end of the activity they compare, they tell each other where they think there's an error or a mistake or something could be better. And of course, this would be followed up by the teacher feedback to ensure that they're not giving the wrong answer. Now, that would depend on the task, of course. Some tasks will be closed, where the answer is clear, it's specific. Others will be open, where there are multiple possible answers. And again, this is leaning towards higher order thinking, critical thinking, and creativity. So it will depend on the task, but certainly students become a great part or an important part of your task design when trying to move them towards teaching. I've got 4 ideas here, and these are just from my own use that I like to do. So instead of having the dialogue elicited from the students, we could present the dialogue, but use the dialogue as a teaching tool to notice and to underline, to take away pieces of language. So this will depend on the task that you set. It could be something as simple as setting sentences with a gap, where students must fill in the gap, and that will help them notice patterns within the text. Or it may be questions, it may be the PMI scale, for example. But turning it around, often the text or the transcript is a great way to help students absorb the language and notice key points, and that will help them to learn. So it's becoming more of a teaching activity. Dictogloss is a form of dictation where teachers will provide a short passage. Students will listen and write, then compare with the partner. They'll listen again, and gradually they'll form the passage without too much support from the teacher. Of course, at the end, where there's still issue, then the teacher may support. And sometimes students may have the opportunity to paraphrase, to change slightly, but ultimately it's giving them a chance to notice and to learn from the content that they're receiving. The other thing, as I mentioned, student-centered activities. So write, compare, add, think, pair together, and then share with the classroom. These are great ways to think about adapting an idea that we see online and changing it into more of a teach activity. Now, it may well be that you want a practice activity. In that case, you don't have to consider this, but hopefully this gives some ideas on how we can flip the activity and use it in a slightly different way. Of course, the final and the most common, perhaps, way of changing it to a teach activity is through a teacher-centered manner, which I'm sure we all do use. So presenting keywords, highlighting key phrases that students need before they deliver or they do the activity. And this way, we're using the teacher as the key resource. And you'll see on these activities, I've actually put 2 different acronyms in brackets. We have MFP at the top and MPF. Can anyone tell me what those letters stand for? So it's a nice way of differentiating between 2 different activities. In this case, we might be teaching vocabulary such as the nouns, the food nouns. Does anyone have any idea what MFP and MPF might stand for? No. So this is a very CELTA acronym going back to CELTA training days. So MFP, ultimately, these are 3 key aspects when we're teaching language that we need to consider. So M is meaning. Thank you, Chanel. Meaning, form, pronunciation. So 3 key aspects of language, and then meaning, pronunciation, and form. So thank you, Marina. So meaning, form, and pronunciation are the 3 words that I'm looking for. With more student-centered activities, then often the form is presented before the pronunciation. And this generally means that we're learning from a text or a transcript. But this allows students a chance to learn from the text themselves, and the teacher acts as if you like, the final person who can feedback, the arbiter, if you like, of the student's response. When it's teacher-centered, if you think about a teacher eliciting words from the students, they'll elicit a word by asking, for example, what is this? The teacher will then receive the word from the student. They may repeat the word to make sure the student's pronunciation is correct. So the students know what it is, the meaning is understood, the pronunciation is clear, then the teacher might write the word on the blackboard. So the form or the written form is then presented. So although it's not always the case, then it's a useful way of considering how your activity is structured. So if you're highlighting meaning, which of course is always first, without meaning, then the form and the pronunciation really don't mean much. Meaning will be first, whether that's through written form or maybe through image, flashcard. Then if the form comes before the pronunciation, often it's the case that the activity will be more student-centered. So not always the case, as I say, but it's something that might help when analysing the activities. So if we take this up beyond the level of the activity, I'd like to just very briefly touch on some common teaching models. Can anyone tell me what these acronyms mean very quickly in the chat? I'm sure you're all familiar with them. The British Council loves its acronyms. Task-based learning, thank you. So that's TBL. PPP, TTT. Presentation, production, practice, thank you. A presentation, practice, production, yes, thank you. And the last one is a test, teach, test. Fantastic. So these are common lesson structures that we use. And, you know, these are starting points. They're not really always something a teacher can use because the students will have preferences, they'll have preferences, time, etc. But perhaps globally, the most commonly used structure or an adaptation of that structure is PPP, presentation, practice, production, where the teacher presents the language, there's controlled practice by the student, and then some freer practice where students get to expand on that a little bit. So it's very safe for the teacher to teach that way because the teacher prescribes the language. It may be based on the syllabus, it may be based on what the teacher wants to teach, and then that's what's taught. Test Teach Test is the test activity first to check what the students know. So again, go back to the activities, test, then teach the activity, test again, and then some practice. So in this case, the teacher is reacting to what the students don't know. So there's more student involvement. Whereas with task-based learning, as you know, that was the first one that came up here, is we start with a task that allows the students to complete the task, and from their use of language and what they need to complete the task, the teacher can support and can teach. So gradually in these three, we see that the lessons are becoming more student-centered. So we've touched on that with MFP and MPF, and this is another example. If I were to ask you ABC, which is PPP, which is TTT, and which is TBL? Which one is A, first of all, if anyone could tell me? Just use the acronym, is fine. Thank you. A is TBL, brilliant. B, okay, thank you. So PPP, and C, of course, is TTT. So you can see visually here how the lesson changes depending on how we structure it. So this is where the structure of our lesson is going to be important. Now, if I put these arrows here, what do these arrows represent in the lesson? What do you think? Good, good. Thank you, Hazel. So this is essentially where the teacher is going to be teaching in these structures. Teacher intervention, perhaps presentation of language. So we see it's different, and that gets us thinking about the different templates we can use, and of course, the different activities we can use. So what are we taking from that online resource? Where are we putting it? What does it need to do? So it's all coming together, if you like, in how we think about it. Now, I want to emphasize that these are starting points. They're not things that we're generally going to take and copy exactly, because you will adapt your lesson as you think is necessary based on what your students like, and of course what works for you as a teacher, because there are some things that we're more confident and comfortable with, and there are some things that we don't like or we don't think are effective, and that's absolutely fine because we all have these preferences based on our experience and context. So we'll run with this as a way of considering now how we might take things from online resources. So again, just to emphasize, it's something that you like. The best thing to really take is an idea you think is good, is going to work, not something that someone kind of imposes on you, because you are the expert in your classroom. We want to pick out, like picking the bones, if you like, of activities and taking something you like, and then we can pad that with activities that we know work in our context, because almost certainly when you look at an activity online, you're not going to be able to take the whole activity. But as I said, it's that small kernel, that rough diamond within, that I think will be most useful. So let's take a very common structure. So here we have PPP, but I've added student discussion and analysis in here. So I've taken that structure and I've added something that I like to do in the lessons just to make it a bit more student-centered. And I add this because it's very common in basic education in particular, because we all have curricula and syllabus that we have to present. So often the teacher will prescribe the language. Hopefully we get a chance to experiment and do other things, but I think this is the most common type of lesson. So I've taken this, I've just put a short description here of what the teacher will do, just to clarify what I expect in the structure. Now, Moving from that, I want to then think about within the structure. So here, for example, taking from the template that we had here, we have presentation, practice, production, but let's take a test, for example, where, excuse me. Okay, so sorry, there's a typo there. That should be teach, not test. So where the teacher wants to teach something, and this could be prescribed by the curriculum. Now, I want to think about that activity. I've already thought of its purpose, its objective. Now I want to break it down into 3 sections because I think, especially when we're thinking about the time it's going to take, this is important. The setup will take a minute or so. The activity or do will take a few minutes, or it could be longer depending on the task. And then feedback. How do we get the information from the students? And of course, at that stage, what can we teach them? Or go deeper, as I said before, how can we extend that activity? Because the feedback stage of any activity is primarily the key point where we can really make students clear on certain points, or teach, if you like. So taking that, we want to think about how we can break it down. So we're building up an idea and a template that we might want to use. So taking that, we think, what template works for me? So again, I've left question marks here. So I've given an example. Whatever works for you, that's something that you will use. You might have multiple templates, but what I would suggest is when you're going to look at online resources, start with a template, and that way you can start to plug things in. You can take something from the online resource, put it where you want it based on what you need in that template, and then you can start to fill the lesson based on that within the objective that you have for that lesson. So rather than just taking the online resource as it is, just accepting it, or just trying to take something and then thinking about, okay, what do I do with it now? Then if you have that template, whether it's through copy and paste from online or writing it down, then it gives you that starting point to build around. And the lesson structure or the flow of the lesson is there for you to basically fill in by yourself. So how can I fill in those gaps? Well, here's another structure. So I put test, teach, test this time, changing them about. And within that, each activity is going to have this task cycle. So setup, do, feedback. And when we think about that, we can think that each activity almost has a little micro activity within it that we can inform. And it gives us a good idea of how we're going to teach, what we're going to teach, and how long it's going to take. So if we take an example, I'm just aware of the time, so I don't want to go too far beyond my time. If we take that, this is my template. And from this, I'm going to look at this activity again from the mapping document that was shared at the beginning. Here we're focusing on health, body parts, healthy lifestyle. It's a lesson plan this time rather than an activity. So we did look at an activity and we considered how we could change that. Now we're looking at a whole lesson plan. Again, a generic lesson plan because it's not intended for you, it's intended for everyone. So what can we take from that? Can we take anything? Maybe not. But certainly at a glance, I found something that I liked. Here is the activity that you'll find when you follow the QR code. And there's a couple of things here that you might notice. There are other activities and links that you can check out. You'll notice that they're Learn English. Now, Learn English is not teaching English. That's for learners specifically, but certainly within those resources, there are things that you could use. The lesson itself is 90 minutes, so it's far too long. We can't use this whole lesson. Parts of the body, this might not be something I specifically want to teach, but it might be related to it. So looking through all of this text, what can I use? And I don't know if you agree with me, but one of the most difficult things I find for teachers is trying to work with someone else's lesson plan, because inevitably what you see on the lesson plan is informed by what's in someone's head, and they can't put it all on a piece of paper, although it does look as if this person has tried. You'll find that lesson plans are either quite sparse and there are gaps, you're not sure how to connect them, perhaps you don't agree, or they're in detail such as this, which becomes quite a chore to get through. But within this, there are rough diamonds. So just as an example, I've chosen one. This is something I really like the idea of, and I think it would be engaging for my students, and it helps me to set up for what I want to teach. So even with all of this text here in the lesson plan, this looks like a great activity, and I'm going to steal it. So I've created this based on the template that I had, and it's a lot of detail here, and some of this is suggestion as an alternative, but I'll give you a second to look through it, and you'll see in red that I've taken that key activity and plugged it into my template, and then I've filled in the template with other ideas that I have to work within that structure and make a logical progression within the lesson. And this is only my idea. This could be changed in any way based on your preference or what you think works. So here we have the labeling and the body outline as a test, actually using it as a way to test what students know. So I've got set up, do feedback, the little task cycle within that. We've got model and check, provide the labels, body parts to complete. And the feedback, which I think is important, we have check and compare. There's the student element to that, peer checking. We could elicit disagreements and check, use that as a way to engage students in providing their answers. We could display, that should be 1 or 2 examples, not a half. I think the formatting has changed there. And you may provide some language exponents that can help students to provide their feedback. So there's another teaching opportunity there. And then based on that, we might want to teach a lot of the words that students haven't come up with. This is particularly important if they're curriculum related or syllabus related words. So this is the teach opportunity for the teacher. They know what the students don't know. Now they want to fill in the gaps. Now MPF we see, so it's teacher centered perhaps, because the teacher is reacting rather than having something pre-prepared that the students might work around. I like having discussion and analysis within the lesson because it really gives an opportunity to introduce some deeper or open questions to get students thinking a bit more about a topic. So the questions I've added here is everyone's body the same? Why? Why not? This could be relation to male, female. It could be relation to perhaps disability. It's something you could expand on within the class. And also the differences between people and animals in terms of body parts. And this opens an opportunity for other parts of a body that may not be related to humans. Finally, trying to create a fun, fair task, something that engages students. I've taken it from the human to a monster because that allows us to add 10 arms, 2 heads, 3 legs, whatever it might be, and really takes the topic to something that allows students to use key language, but goes beyond the original context, and I hope would be motivating for them. So ultimately, I've taken my template and I've taken one idea from the online resource. I've considered where I want it. So I know it's going to be a test, and I put it into that section of my template. And then I've considered the task cycle within. So what am I going to do to set up? What am I going to do or ask the students to do as part of the activity? And how am I going to feedback on that? Because that's my chance to really check that they understand, but also as a teaching opportunity within the activity itself. So templates and mantras is how I started today's session. And I think that's really how I'd like to end as well. So the 3 things I hope we've covered today and we've touched on, and again, looking at these across a general sense or a general context, online context, there are 3 areas that we can consider in advance of accessing online resources. The activity, the task cycle within that activity, and your template. What are you taking to engage with that activity, where you can take that rough diamond, that kernel, and place it in the template and build around that something that works for your context. So the 5 lines at the side, keep what you want in mind as you browse. So it's something that you want, and that will be based on your preference. Focus on what works for you and your context, i.e. your students. Don't change too much just because the activity does it in a different way. Try and bring it towards you. Remember, there are multiple teaching points within the lesson. So we've mentioned the activity type, you have the stage within the model, and of course the feedback. These are great opportunities to teach within any activity or to adapt an activity to a more teacher focus, but also a chance to go deeper into more 21st century skills as well. I would certainly say ensure you have a template in mind as a guide, and adapt, adopt, or reject with a big emphasis on adapt, because that's the key. There are so many resources out there, millions and millions. If you have a method of accessing them and bringing them back to your classroom, then you're going to be all the better for it. So thank you so much for your attention today. I hope that's been useful. And I realize I've been speaking a bit faster as I went through some of these stages, tripping over my words and my accent. Kunya, I think we'll stop there. And I hope, as I say, I hope that's been useful for everyone and given some ideas on how we might adapt online resources.
Thank you so much for your informative and insightful presentation, Fraser. We've got some questions from the audience. And are you ready to answer the questions?
Yes, I've taken my
Okay. All right. I'm not so sure if you can answer it, but the first question is, what is the best score for teaching IELTS?
What is the best score?
For teaching IELTS.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I think the score that students achieve will be based on what they require it for. I think, just from kind of some knowledge of the system, generally for middle schools, for example, students who are taking IELTS for that purpose of maybe going abroad, then I think 5.5 is roughly about the score. But for university and academic, you require 6.57 or above to access those courses, but it will come down to the institution and their requirements. So that would be the target, I assume, for the student rather than the teacher. Oh, and the teacher, of course.
Okay, I see. All right. Thank you so much. I'd like to ask a question for you. You mentioned about 21st century skills, right?
Yeah.
So how important is considering 21st century skills when adapting tasks in English classrooms?
I think it's very important, not just for English. I think in any classroom. And I think we already see it or have seen it traditionally in other subjects, because a lot of evaluation and assessment is involved in scientific and mathematical subjects. So I do think that English offers a great opportunity to do that as well, because of the number of tasks that we use. We touched on critical thinking, and one of the other, I think, important 21st century skills that we didn't touch on is creativity. And I think one of the key tenets of creativity is actually, creativity is not just about creating from nothing. I think there's always some kind of structure that we create within that helps us to channel that creativity. And I think when it comes to students, it's similar creativity in language as well as creativity in art, that if we can structure the activities in a way that helps guide the students, they can start to be creative with their language. In a similar way, teachers with the templates that we mentioned can be creative within the templates that they've created, because it's very daunting to just create something from nothing. Therefore, having a template to work within, or having those parameters to work within, is really important, because these skills now are just so necessary. It's not just about having a language, one language, two languages, three languages. I think in the future, there's not going to be a limit on the number of languages needed, but also the skills that go alongside language are absolutely necessary for future employment and other elements of daily life, really.
Okay, I see. Thank you so much. Thank you for your answer. And we have another question from the audience. I'd like to use authentic materials such as articles, but I find it difficult to adapt the materials to the level of students. So in this case, what's your advice?
I mean, this will depend on why that's been introduced, of course. But I think I touched on an old Celta mantra in the session today that I wouldn't change the text, the authentic text, because you want to show students what they're going to meet in real life. But what I would do is perhaps consider adapting the task to be achievable for that student. Now, that might also mean taking a portion of the text and not the whole text, and using that as the text that students will analyze. So there are ways of adapting without actually changing the language and the authenticity, which I think has real benefit to a student when it comes to language exposure. So I would, try and create multiple tasks that allow students to choose what they can achieve, and B, perhaps take parts of text or parts of the authentic text rather than the whole text to help them be able to manage that text and not demotivate or turn them off. And thirdly, I think having a chat with that student, finding out what they'd like to do and how much they think they can achieve is important, because they may want to try that more difficult text and challenge themselves, or they may be happy at a level where they have a feeling of achievement and moving forward. But of course, if you're leading towards an exam at the end of the curriculum, then you have to consider what that student needs to know as part of your teaching plan. Kunya, there's a question in the chat that asked about multimedia.
Yeah.
I think this is an interesting one for me, because this is the flip side of digital ICT and tools in the classroom, and I'm certainly an advocate of using them, but I think to some extent we've gone too far in many cases. And I remember, I think it was Fisher in the early 2000s highlighted interactive whiteboards as a solution looking for a problem. And in some cases, there's a danger that technology can become that, to the detriment of the teaching and the learning in the classroom. So I've seen many classrooms, for example, where the teacher has wonderful PPTs, the students are staring at a screen, and there's video and things, but the teacher perhaps hasn't considered how these can be used effectively within the classroom and the teaching. And this comes back to, what's the purpose of that video? Why are we using it? And how can we use it as an opportunity to teach? So I think there's a similarity between the digital resource we download and how we can analyze these and use them, and also the tools that we use in the classroom. The question has to arise, do we need it? Can we engage students in a different way? Ultimately, if you're looking at a screen, as we all are now, we're probably not talking to the person to our left or right, if there is anyone, and that's the same with students. So in a language classroom, that actually could be detrimental. So we need to consider how we can use that in moderation.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer. There are lots of things to consider when we use the multimedia in the classroom, right?
Yes.
Okay, and related question is that, what do you think about tablet-based teaching? Many students and teachers are using tablet these days. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, my own children, they learn language through a tablet. I don't find it very effective at all without strong parental support, because there's a difficulty when it comes to management of the student, especially younger students who get distracted very easily. But I think most teachers would agree, and maybe perhaps not, but my own opinion is that most of the learning a student acquires in any subject, and in particular language, is happening outside of the classroom. The teacher's there as a guide. We're providing activities and practice, correction and support, but there has to be something happen away from the classroom. And it's the same with the tablet. If we're talking about tablets at home, the parents need to be there and supporting the student, reviewing the language with them, practicing it. Otherwise, I think it's really very difficult for it to be successful just through a tablet medium by itself.
Thank you so much. And then, what is your own tip for making deeper thinking questions?
Well, I mean, why questions, either as an initial or a follow-up, is very important. And that's ultimately why is used in the IELTS test as a follow-up question, because it's intended to elicit a deeper answer. But be careful, because why questions are not always deep questions. So you have to think about, if you pre-plan your questions, what do the students have to do to answer that question? For example, why do you like chocolate? It's sweet. You know, students can answer like that. There's not really any thinking going on there. So even though it's a why question, it doesn't always elicit a deeper answer. So please do think about what the question is, but also what the student has to do mentally to be able to answer the question. Do they actually have to analyze, evaluate, or create, which are the three higher order thinking skills that we would hope to, to tap into as part of a deeper learning question.
Thank you so much. And the next topic and next question is, what is the future of non-native versus native English teachers teaching English in a global perspective? What's your opinion about that?
I think that's a very big question. Certainly, I think that the idea of native speakerism is questioned to begin with. So the terms themselves are problematic, and who English belongs to. I think, we talk about global English and different kinds of English. Realistically speaking, within exam systems and curriculums, people will have a preference, whether it's American English, British English. Generally, it's not Scottish English, I must say. And they'll teach towards that because it gives them parameters to work within. But my own feeling, and this is a personal opinion, it's not in any way representative of the British Council, is that teachers who speak the native language of the students generally, with good technique and planning, will be more effective teachers because they have extra tools that they can apply. And I think only speaking in English in the classroom is something related to the more communicative approach of the past, and it's just not effective in every classroom. So I think L1 has to be there as a support mechanism, whether it's for discipline, classroom management, but also to engage students and to avoid frustration in learning, which can turn them off English entirely. So I'm certainly a big advocate of teachers who can speak the L1 and L2 and use them both in the classroom.
Thank you so much for your insightful answer. If we go back to the web-based resources, how much of the web-based resources do you think are given right credit when they are being adopted in classrooms?
Probably not enough. I mean, I think there's perhaps there's obviously different licensing, like Creative Commons and things in the UK, and the ability to use that. Most of the resources that we use, for example, Teach English, are free to download and are usable in any way you wish. Of course, when you get to platforms where you have to pay for materials, then their copyright will be different. So you have to be aware of that. And if you're using publishable, published materials, then I would certainly say you have to reference it within your work. So credit where credit's due, show where it came from. I mean, in some cases, when you just take an idea or a game in a much larger lesson plan, then it might be hard to link it to that. But of course, there's no harm in doing so. So I would say, please do give credit to whomever came up with the good idea that you're using, because they deserve it for sharing it and creating.
Thank you so much. Another question is, he or she is using great examples from the British Council websites. So can you recommend any more other online materials for ESL young learners?
I mean, there are things like, other websites like Times Educational Supplement, One Stop English. And there are many that pop up from now and again. But you'll find that many of them are behind paywalls. So it's hard for me to recommend one because I'm not entirely sure what the situation is. Some of them are free and then they're not free. And those are sites that are available. But I think in this case, Google is your friend, or Bing or ChatGPT perhaps, to help you find and really explore, because sometimes you'll find websites have certain kinds of materials and they're not really working for you. I think we touched on earlier that many of the British Council resources are for private language classes, longer classrooms, smaller groups. So that's something that you have to consider, that when adapting, it's going to be into larger classes. It's going to be more related to public or basic education, and that brings different factors that you have to consider. So I don't really have any other specific recommendations. As I say, Times Education Supplement has some wonderful resources, but they will require a lot more adaptation than what you might find on Teaching English. And One Stop English, I think, is behind a paywall now, so you might get some free resources there and worksheets, but most of them you have to pay for. But when you do get those worksheets, remember, how does it fit into your template? What's the purpose of the worksheet? Do keep that in mind when you're plugging into what you want to do.
Thank you so much. Maybe this would be the last question today.
Sure.
So for young language learners, it always takes more time to complete a task, and it's not easy to provide solid feedback in class if the course is a somewhat advanced level. What are some ways to give more effective and solid feedback in class?
It's a good question. There are many different ways to give feedback, and I guess this will depend on many factors. It will depend on the number of students. It will depend on what your objective or success criteria is for that activity or for the lesson. Certainly, it will also depend on what kind of activity it is, because the feedback may not be specific, i.e. that if it's a more creative activity, then there'll be multiple possible answers. So it's more about sharing the possibilities rather than trying to clarify students have something right. I would say, well, feedback can be done, of course, in the next lesson if the teacher needs time, but there are many ways to do feedback. You could do it as, if it's a language point, teacher could explicitly correct based on elicitation. If there's a group work session going on, the teacher might want to take notes of common errors and mistakes, place it on the board and have students correct them. We call that delayed correction, and it gets the class involved in correcting, so it helps people to notice. If you're talking about, very high level students and you want to go into detailed feedback on grammar, etc., or something that may be more than you can do in class, then I think you're probably going to have to think about ways to do that outside of the classroom. Or you could use a display. So, for example, if you have the work on the wall, the teacher could add notes at the end of class, and students come back into the next class and they see that, and they can actually go around and see different students' work as a point of comparison. So we call that a gallery walk, but there's ways of adapting that. So it's difficult because really this question will come down to what you're doing, what you're trying to teach, and what kind of feedback you want to give, whether that's detail or general, or just focusing on key areas that you think will be useful in a more systematic way for students to assimilate and use or adapt to in future. So it's a difficult question to answer. It's a good question, but a very difficult one to answer in a specific way.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. There were so many questions, but actually you answered almost all of them. So thank you so much. And lastly, would you leave a last note for Korean teachers or teacher educators?
Well, first of all, thank you for joining today. It's really been a pleasure to be part of this. This is my first chance to engage with teachers in Korea, so thank you very much. What I would say is, I think, just going back to my point about creativity, when we're looking at the huge plethora of resources that are available to us online, and teachers in every country have the same problem, give yourself some parameters to work within that you can draw down into, because you need to keep that deep link to your own context and how you teach. It's more about absorbing bits, and don't try not to look at a resource and reject it immediately, because often that rough diamond is in there that you can take, and that may spark that classroom idea that wasn't there before. So I do hope that that's the case. And really, I wish you all very well. There's so many resources out there. It can be daunting. I hope you find resources that work for you. They are out there. We just have to find them.
Thank you so much, Fraser. So it was really interactive and informative and insightful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kia. Thank you.
Now it's time for post-survey. So please have your time to complete the post-survey. And then if you complete your post-survey, there will be a link to the e-certificate. Please download it and delete name and surname and write your own name and surname and save the certificate, and it's your e-certificate. Now we have webinar 5 next week, and that will be the last webinar in season 2. In webinar 5, Ian Keddy, educational consultant, British Council, he will talk about using digital resources to develop intercultural communication and global citizenship in English classrooms. So I hope I can see you next week. Thank you for joining webinar 4 today, and then I'll see you next week for webinar 5, which is the last webinar in season 2. Thank you very much, and have a great weekend. Bye, everyone.